The obsidian halls of Station Paramount had stood for 40,000 years at the edge of known space, and in all that time, the 12 elder species of the Valith Conclave had never once failed to bring a younger race to heel. That was the thing about the Conclave. It did not negotiate with lesser species, it did not reason with them, and it certainly did not fear them. So when the long-range sensor arrays first detected the crude radio signals bleeding out from a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, the response was immediate and automatic. Ambassador Salith of the Rythan Dominion stood before the assembled representatives in the great circular chamber, his insectoid body towering nearly 9 feet tall, his 4 compound eyes scanning the holographic display that rotated slowly above the speaking platform. "The species calls itself humanity," he said, his mandibles clicking with each syllable. "They have achieved basic spaceflight within their own star system, and they possess crude but functional nuclear weaponry. They are noisy, aggressive, and expanding." A murmur rippled through the chamber, like wind through dry grass. "How long before they develop faster-than-light capability?" asked Councillor Draven of the Netlari Communion, her pale translucent skin pulsing faintly with bioluminescent thought patterns. Salith checked the data projections, and his antennae twitched with something that might have been amusement. "At their current rate of advancement, perhaps 300 standard cycles, perhaps fewer if they are left unchecked." "Then we do not leave them unchecked," said Draven simply, and that was that. The vote was unanimous, as it always was in matters like these. The Conclave had performed this exact procedure on over 300 species across the millennia, and the outcome was always the same. The younger species resisted for a time, then broke, then submitted, and then was folded into the vast machinery of Conclave civilization as laborers or servants, or occasionally as minor trade partners if they proved useful enough. No species had ever successfully resisted. Not once. The Kelthari were chosen for the task, as they almost always were. They were the Conclave's blade, its fist, its teeth in the dark. A reptilian warrior species that stood 7 feet tall on average and had been bred for combat across 100 generations. Their scales could turn aside low-caliber projectiles. Their reflexes were twice as fast as most other Conclave species, and their culture was built entirely around the concept of martial perfection. 10,000 of the finest Kelthari warriors were assembled aboard the dreadnought Teeth of Silence, the largest and most powerful warship in the Conclave's fleet. A vessel nearly 2 miles long, bristling with plasma batteries and shielded by energy barriers that could withstand the focused output of a small star. Warlord Tassoc, the commander of the expedition, stood on the bridge of the great ship as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and he looked upon the tiny blue marble hanging in the void, and he felt nothing but contempt. He had conquered 11 worlds before this one. He had broken species that were stronger, faster, and more technologically advanced than these humans. This would be the easiest campaign of his career. "Open a channel to the surface," he ordered, and his deep, rumbling voice carried the absolute certainty of a predator that had never known defeat. The broadcast was simple and direct. It was transmitted on every frequency the humans used, translated into their most common languages by the ship's linguistic systems. "People of Earth, you are now under the jurisdiction of the Valith Conclave. You will disarm all military forces immediately. You will surrender all governmental authority to Conclave representatives. Resistance will result in the destruction of your population centers. You have 1 planetary rotation to comply." Tassoc expected panic. He expected desperate pleas for mercy, or perhaps a hasty and disorganized attempt at negotiation. That was how it usually went. Instead, what came back was a chaotic mess of signals from dozens of different sources across the planet. Some governments broadcast frantic messages of surrender. Others broadcast open defiance. Some tried to negotiate terms. Military channels erupted with activity as forces around the world mobilized. Civilian broadcasts ranged from terror to fury to something Tasok did not immediately recognize. It was laughter. Some of the humans were actually laughing. Tasok dismissed it as hysteria, a common response among primitive species facing their first contact with a superior civilization. He had seen it before, and it meant nothing. Pose. When the deadline passed without unified surrender, Tasok ordered the ground deployment. 50 dropships carrying 200 warriors each descended through Earth's atmosphere, targeted at the largest population centers on every continent. The plan was standard: secure the capitals, neutralize the military command structures, and establish conclave authority from the top down. The dropships entered the atmosphere on what the humans called a Tuesday afternoon. Tasok watched the deployment from the bridge, with his arms folded across his massive chest and his yellow eyes half-closed with boredom. He expected the operation to take no more than 2 planetary rotations. The first 10 minutes went exactly as planned. The dropships landed without resistance in open areas near the target cities. The Kelvari warriors poured out in perfect formation, their plasma rifles charged, their battle formations tight and disciplined, toward the city centers, with the mechanical precision of a species that had perfected the art of planetary conquest over thousands of years. Then the helmet cameras began to flicker. Tasok leaned forward in his command chair, as the feeds from the surface started showing things he did not understand. The streets were empty, but not in the way that suggested the population had fled in terror. They were empty in a way that felt deliberate, arranged, almost like a trap. One of his battalion commanders reported in with confusion in his voice. "Warlord, the structures appear to be abandoned, but our thermal sensors are detecting heat signatures everywhere, in the walls, beneath the ground, above us, in the upper levels of these buildings. They are all around us, but we cannot see." The transmission cut to static. Tasok switched to another feed and saw a flash of light, and then nothing. He switched to another and heard screaming. Kelvari screaming was a sound he had never heard before in his entire military career. He switched to another and saw one of his warriors on the ground, clawing at a hole in his armor, where something small and fast had punched through the joint beneath his arm. The warrior was trying to stand, but another impact knocked him sideways, and then another, and then another. The feeds went dark, one by one. Within 30 minutes, Tasok had lost contact with every single ground team on every single continent. 10,000 Kelvari warriors, the finest soldiers the Conclave had ever produced, had walked into the cities of Earth with absolute confidence. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing Warlord Tasok had ever heard. 6 standard cycles passed aboard the Teeth of Silence, and in all that time, not a single transmission came from the surface of the blue world below. Warlord Tasok had not slept. He had not eaten. He had stood on the bridge of his dreadnought, staring at the planet through the massive viewport, with his clawed hands gripping the railing so hard that the metal had begun to bend beneath his fingers. 10,000 warriors gone, not dead as far as he knew, because there had been no confirmed kill reports, no distress beacons activated, no emergency extraction requests, just silence, complete and absolute, as if the planet itself had swallowed them whole. His second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Risk, approached him carefully on the 7th day. "Warlord, the reserve forces are ready, 2,000 shock troops, fully armed, and armored with heavy weapons support. I recommend we deploy them to establish a secured landing zone and work outward from there." Tasok turned his yellow eyes toward Risk, and for the first time in his long career, the old warrior saw something in his commander's gaze that looked dangerously close to uncertainty. "Deploy them," Tasok said quietly, "but tell them to expect resistance unlike anything in our combat records." The second wave descended in heavily armored gunships rather than standard dropships. They chose a landing zone in a region the humans called the Midwest, a vast flat expanse of golden fields and scattered settlements that offered clear sightlines in every direction. There would be no ambushes here, no urban canyons to hide in, no tall structures to fire from. It was perfect terrain for Kelvari tactics. The gunships touched down, and the shock troops fanned out in textbook formation. Their helmet cameras transmitted crisp, clear footage back to the teeth of silence, where Tasok and his bridge crew watched on every available screen. Minutes. There was nothing. Just wind moving through the golden grain, and the sound of Kelvari boots on dirt roads. The thermal scanners showed the area was sparsely populated, with scattered heat signatures in distant farmhouses and small clusters of buildings. "It is quiet," Risk observed from beside Tasok. "Too quiet," the warlord replied, and he was right. At the 12-minute mark, the road beneath the lead column erupted. Something buried deep underground detonated with enough force to flip a Kelvari heavy transport vehicle end over end. The explosion sent warriors flying in every direction, and before they could recover, the sound of gunfire erupted from what seemed like everywhere at once. Tasok watched the helmet feeds with growing horror, as his elite troops scrambled for cover. The humans were firing from positions that should have been impossible, from inside haystacks and grain silos, from ditches that had been dug and camouflaged days before, perhaps weeks in advance, from the windows of farmhouses that thermal scans had shown as containing only civilians. Because the civilians were the fighters. An elderly human male who had been sitting on a porch in a rocking chair when the Kelvari passed by was now firing a large-caliber rifle with deadly accuracy from behind an overturned water trough. A young female who had been herding animals in a field had pulled a weapon from beneath a feeding station and was coordinating attacks using a small communication device strapped to her wrist. The Kelvari shock troops were not dying easily. Their armor was strong and their training was superb. They returned fire with plasma weapons that turned dirt to glass and wood to ash. But for every human position they destroyed, 3 more opened up from different angles. What stunned Tasok most was the coordination. These were not trained soldiers operating under a central military command. These were farmers, shopkeepers and mechanics and teachers, and they were fighting together as if they had been preparing for this exact moment their entire lives. One helmet camera showed a Kelvari warrior cornering a group of humans in a damaged structure. The warrior kicked down the door expecting to find cowering civilians. Instead, he found a room full of people, assembling improvised explosive devices from farming chemicals and household materials with the calm, focused efficiency of factory workers. They looked up at the warrior. One of them, a middle-aged human with dirt on his face and grease on his hands, actually smiled at the Kelvari before pressing a button on the device in front of him. That camera feed went black. Another feed showed something even more disturbing. A squad of Kelvari had captured a group of human children, expecting to use them as leverage to force the local fighters to stand down. But before they could issue demands, produced small bladed weapons hidden in their clothing and attacked the warriors' exposed joints and sensor equipment with a ferocity that bordered on insanity. These humans did not behave like any conquered species in Conclave history. Conquered species ran, they hid, they begged, they surrendered when the odds turned against them. These humans did none of those things. When they were outgunned, they fell back and set traps. When they were surrounded, they fought until they could not stand, and then they crawled. When their weapons ran empty, they threw rocks and swung tools and used their bare hands. And worst of all, they helped each other with a devotion that Tasok could not comprehend. When a human fighter fell, other humans would rush into open fire to drag them to safety. Not soldiers retrieving a valuable asset, but neighbors and friends and strangers risking everything, because something deep inside them simply would not allow them to leave one of their own behind. By the time the second wave's communications went silent, Tasok had watched enough footage to understand something that chilled his blood, despite the warmth of the bridge. This was not a military they were fighting. This was a species. Every single human on that planet, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, was a combatant. Not because they had been ordered to fight, but because something in their very nature refused to accept subjugation. It was woven into their blood, and their bones, and their history. They had been fighting each other for their entire existence as a species, and they had gotten terrifyingly good at it. Tasok made his decision in silence. He turned to Risk and spoke 2 words that would seal the fate of every Kelvari aboard the Teeth of Silence. Everyone goes. Risk stared at him. Warlord, if we commit the entire reserve, the ship will be defended only by a skeleton crew. If something goes wrong on the surface, nothing will go wrong, Tasok said, but even as the words left his mouth, he did not believe them. Every remaining warrior aboard the dreadnought was deployed. Every cook, every technician, every pilot who could hold a weapon. They descended to the surface in a massive wave of gunships and dropships and armored transports, leaving the Teeth of Silence crewed by fewer than 50 non-combat personnel. Tasok himself went down with them. He would not ask his warriors to face something he was unwilling to face himself. It was the Kelvahari way. He stepped onto the soil of Earth, with his plasma blade humming at his side, and the afternoon sun warm on his scales, and he looked out across the golden fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was beautiful, he realized. This small blue world was genuinely, heartbreakingly beautiful. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. Then the ground began to tremble, and Warlord Tasok understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he had made the last mistake of his life. Back at Station Paramount, the Valeth Conclave waited for his victory report. They waited for a very long time. The word that spread through the halls of Station Paramount was not defeat, because the Conclave had no word for defeat. In 40,000 years of galactic governance, they had simply never needed one. What they had instead was a growing, creeping, suffocating silence that poured out of the Sol system like a cold wind from an open grave. The Teeth of Silence, the mightiest warship ever built by the Kelvari Dominion, 2 miles of armored fury carrying enough firepower to crack a continent, was still in orbit around the blue world, but it was dark and drifting, and when the Conclave sent a long-range reconnaissance probe to investigate, the images it returned caused something very close to panic among species that had believed themselves to be beyond such primitive emotions. The dreadnought was intact. Its hull was undamaged, its weapons were still mounted, its engines were still attached, but every system aboard was powered down, and the probe sensors detected human life signs inside the vessel. Humans had boarded the most powerful warship in the Conclave's fleet. Humans, a species that had not even achieved faster-than-light travel, had somehow reached orbit, breached the hull of a ship designed to withstand siege warfare, and taken it. Ambassador Salith demanded answers that no one could provide. The Kelvari Military Council demanded vengeance. The Netlari Communion demanded caution. And in the end, as always, the Conclave chose escalation. They assembled the Cyrothi Phalanx. This was not a simple military force. This was the Conclave's answer to the impossible. A combined arms task force, drawn from the elite units of 5 different species, each bringing capabilities that complemented the others in ways that had made the Phalanx undefeatable across 300 years of deployment. The Netlari contributed their mind-benders, psychic warriors who could reach into an enemy's thoughts and fill their minds with terror and confusion and paralyzing despair. They had broken the will of entire armies without firing a single weapon. The Gorvan provided their heavy infantry, massive armored beings encased in plasma-shielded exoskeletons that could walk through artillery fire without slowing down. Each one was a walking fortress capable of leveling a city block. The Yith sent their combat drones, Millions of small autonomous units, guided by a hive-mind intelligence that could adapt to battlefield conditions in real time and coordinate attacks with mathematical precision. The Rithon contributed their Void Hunters, stealth operatives who could become nearly invisible and move through any environment undetected. And the Kelvari, burning with shame and fury over the loss of the Teeth of Silence, sent another 5,000 of their warriors hungry for revenge. 30,000 troops in total, carried by a fleet of 9 warships under the command of Fleet Commander Ovaris of the Netlari Communion. Ovaris was not like the other commanders the Conclave had sent. She was small for a Netlari, barely 6 feet tall, with skin so pale it was nearly transparent, and eyes that glowed with a soft blue light that intensified when she was thinking deeply. She was considered the most brilliant strategic mind of her generation, and she had earned that reputation by never underestimating an enemy. Before her fleet departed, she locked herself in her quarters for 3 full days, and studied everything the Conclave had on humanity. Not just the military reports, but their history, their culture, their art, their science, their mythology. She read their stories, and watched their recorded broadcasts, and listened to their music. And when she emerged, her glowing eyes were troubled in a way her crew had never seen before. She filed a private report to the Conclave before entering the Sol system, and it contained a warning. Later be recognized as the most accurate assessment any Conclave official had ever made about a younger species. This species does not respond to overwhelming force with submission. It responds with adaptation. They are not strong because of their bodies or their technology. They are strong because of something inside them that I can only describe as an absolute refusal to accept that any obstacle is permanent. Their entire history is a record of facing impossible odds and finding ways through them. I recommend we reconsider our approach entirely. NP. The Conclave told her to proceed with the operation. Ovaris obeyed, but she changed the tactics. There would be no ground deployment, not at first. Instead, she positioned her fleet in high orbit and began a systematic campaign of precision strikes against every identifiable military installation on the planet's surface. Missile silos, air bases, naval facilities, communication centers, satellite uplink stations. Anything that looked like it could coordinate a military response was targeted and destroyed from orbit. It was clean and efficient and devastating, and for the first 3 days it appeared to be working. The humans' organized military capability was being methodically dismantled, and without it, they would be reduced to scattered groups of fighters with no way to coordinate. Or so Ovaris believed. On the 4th day, her sensors detected something that should have been impossible. Energy signatures consistent with Kelvari plasma technology were appearing at multiple locations across the planet's surface. But they were not Kelvari signatures. They were modified, altered, crude but functional, and they were multiplying. The humans had been taking apart captured Kelvari weapons and equipment since the first warriors fell. They had studied the technology with the desperate focused intensity of a species fighting for its survival, and they had figured out how it worked. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but well enough. On the 7th day, something streaked up from the planet's surface and struck one of Ovirus's warships amidships. It was a missile, but not a human chemical missile. It was a plasma-tipped warhead built from salvaged Kelvari components. Launched from a rail system that the humans had constructed in less than a week, using principles they had reverse-engineered from captured Conclave technology. The warship's shields held against the first impact, but just barely. The second missile, which arrived 40 seconds later from a completely different location, was slightly more refined than the first. The third, which arrived 2 minutes after that, punched clean through the shields and detonated against the hull. Ovirus lost her first warship on the 9th day. She lost her second on the 14th. By the 21st day, the humans were launching coordinated salvos of plasma missiles from dozens of locations, hidden sites across the planet, and each salvo was more accurate and more powerful than the last. They were not just copying the technology, they were improving it, iterating on it, pushing it beyond what the Kelvari themselves had achieved. Ovirus sat alone in her command chamber on the 22nd day, and she understood with the cold clarity of a brilliant mind confronting an inescapable truth, that the Conclave had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had not come to pacify a primitive species. They had come to a world full of beings who learned faster than any species in the galaxy, who adapted to threats with a speed that defied every model the Conclave possessed, and who became more dangerous with every passing hour. She opened a channel to Station Paramount and transmitted 6 words in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly terrified. "Do not send anyone else, please." Then she ordered her remaining ships to retreat. Been monitoring Conclave communications for weeks by then, and they had learned the fleet's formation patterns and exit vectors. 2 more warships were struck by missiles as they attempted to break orbit. Ovirus managed to get 4 ships out of the system, 4 out of 9. And as her fleet limped away at faster-than-light speed, she looked back at the blue world shrinking in her view screen, and she understood something that would haunt her for the rest of her long life. The Conclave had come to Earth believing they were the teachers and humanity was the student. They had been wrong about who was learning from whom. The survivors began arriving at Station Paramount in small broken groups over the weeks that followed, and the stories they carried with them spread through the Conclave like a virus that infected the mind with something the elder species had not felt in millennia: fear. Not the manageable strategic concern that came with a difficult military campaign, and not the calculated risk assessment that accompanied any engagement with an unknown force. This was something older and deeper and more primal. This was the kind of fear that crawled into the belly and nested there like a living thing. The first to arrive were a handful of Gorvon heavy infantry who had been captured during the ground operations. Massive armored beings who had walked through plasma fire on a dozen worlds without flinching. They came back hollow-eyed and quiet, stripped of their weapons and their exoskeletons, but otherwise unharmed. That was the part that confused everyone. Unharmed. PC. The humans had captured them and disarmed them and held them for weeks. And during that time, they had been fed, given water, provided with basic medical treatment for their wounds, and then loaded into Kelvari escape pods and launched into orbit with enough fuel to reach the nearest Conclave relay station. Etched into the armor plating of every escape pod, carved with careful precision in 17 different Conclave languages, was the same message. "We did not start this. We are ending it. Go home. Tell them." The Conclave Intelligence Division debriefed every single survivor in sealed chambers deep within Station Paramount. They used every technique available to them, including Netlari telepathic scanning, to verify that the accounts were genuine and unaltered. What they found was consistent across every species, every unit, every individual who had set foot on Earth and lived to leave it. The humans learned in real time, phrase that appeared in report after report, spoken by warriors and officers and technicians from 5 different species, who had no reason to coordinate their stories and every reason to simply report the truth. The humans learned in real time, and they learned faster than anything the Conclave had ever encountered. Every tactic worked exactly once. The Kelvari had used a standard flanking maneuver that had been effective against every species they had ever fought. And the first time they used it on Earth, it worked, and they killed dozens of human fighters. The second time they used it, the humans were ready, and the Kelvari walked into a trap that cost them an entire platoon. By the third engagement, the humans were using a modified version of the same flanking tactic against the Kelvari themselves. Communication frequencies that were supposed to be unbreakable were jammed within days, then decoded within hours after that, and then hijacked and used to broadcast. Messages in perfect Kelvari military code. Messages that ranged from false orders designed to create confusion to a simple repeating phrase that one translator rendered as, "You should not have come here." The Yith hive mind drones, which had never been countered by any species in 300 years of deployment, were neutralized within the first week. The humans figured out the frequency the hive mind used to coordinate its units, and they flooded it with noise, turning millions of precision-guided combat drones into useless metal falling from the sky. And then the humans collected the fallen drones and took them apart and started building their own. The Netlari mindbenders, who had shattered the psychological resistance of 100 species, found something in human minds that they had never encountered before. The psychic assault that should have filled humans with paralyzing terror instead triggered something the Netlari could only describe as a rage response. Intense and so focused that it actually damaged the mindbenders who attempted it. 3 Netlari operatives suffered permanent psychic burns from trying to break human minds, and the survivors reported that touching a human consciousness under threat was like reaching into a fire that burned with the heat of a star. But it was the testimony of Risk, the old Kelvari veteran who had served as second-in-command aboard the Teeth of Silence, that was classified at the highest level and restricted to Conclave leadership only. Risk had been among the last Kelvari standing during the final engagement on the surface. His unit had been pushed back into the ruins of a human city that had been heavily damaged by orbital strikes. They were surrounded, cut off from extraction, and running low on ammunition. He described how the circle closed around them over the course of 3 days. Not in a rush, not in a final overwhelming assault, but slowly and patiently, the way a river wears down stone. The humans tightened the perimeter hour by hour, cutting off escape routes, eliminating sight lines, reducing the area the Kelvari could occupy, until they were trapped in a single collapsed building with no power and no communications. On the 3rd night, with only 7 warriors left alive around him, Risk heard footsteps approaching through the rubble. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. A single set of footsteps. A human appeared in the doorway, small by Kelvari standards, barely reaching Risk's chest. The human was wearing battered clothing, covered in dust and blood, and carrying no visible weapon. Strapped to the human's wrist was a crude device that Risk recognized as being assembled from the translation circuits of a Kelvari combat helmet. The human sat down in the rubble across from Risk, pulled a container of water from a pouch, and held it out toward the Kelvari warrior. Risk told the Conclave that he had killed over 1,000 enemies across 11 campaigns, and that in that moment, sitting in the ruins of a human city, he did not know what to do with the water being offered to him by a creature he had been sent to conquer. He took it, he drank, and the human watched him with eyes that held no hatred, and no fear, and no triumph. Then the human spoke through the crude translator, and the words came out broken and imperfect, but perfectly clear. "We do not want to kill you. We never wanted any of this, but we will not kneel, not for you, not for anyone. It is just not in us." Risk said he looked into the human's eyes and searched for the things he expected to find there: the bloodlust of a predator, the fanaticism of an ideologue, the cold calculation of a professional soldier. But none of those things were present. What he found instead was something he had never seen in any species across any world in his entire long career of war. Stillness at the center of this small, fragile being that was harder than Kelvari armor, and deeper than the void between stars. It was not courage exactly, because courage implies the presence of fear being overcome. This was something beyond courage. This was a fundamental certainty, written into the very core of this creature's being, that it had the right to be free, and that nothing in the universe, no force, no fleet, no empire, could take that right away. Risk stood before the Conclave leadership and delivered his assessment in a voice that shook for the first time in his life. They are not the most dangerous species because of their weapons or their tactics. They are the most dangerous species because every single one of them believes it. Every soldier and every farmer and every child believes in their bones that they deserve to be free, and they will burn everything to ashes before they let anyone take that from them. We did not lose because we were outfought. We lost because we tried to conquer a species that cannot be conquered. The very concept of submission does not exist inside them. The chamber was silent for a very long time after he finished speaking. And somewhere far away, on a small blue world, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, the humans were not resting, and they were not celebrating their victory. The Conclave did not send another fleet. It was not mercy that stayed their hand, and it was not wisdom, not at first. It was mathematics, cold and simple and terrifying. In the 6 months since the first Kelvari dropships had descended through Earth's atmosphere on that quiet Tuesday afternoon, humanity had undergone a technological transformation that shattered every model the Conclave had ever built for predicting the advancement of younger species. Before contact, the humans had been a fragmented collection of rival nations with crude chemical rockets and primitive nuclear weapons. They had been centuries away from faster-than-light travel by any reasonable projection. 6 months later, they had it. The captured Kelvari technology had been the spark. The dreadnought Teeth of Silence, now controlled entirely by human engineers and scientists, had been taken apart piece by piece and studied with an intensity that bordered on obsession. System. Every component, every principle of physics that the Conclave had spent millennia developing was analyzed and understood, and then improved upon by minds that seemed to have no upper limit on how fast they could absorb new information. The faster-than-light drive was the crown jewel. Human physicists had stared at the Kelvari warp core for 3 weeks, and then built a better one. Not a copy, not a reproduction, but a fundamentally improved design that was 30% more efficient and could be manufactured using materials available on Earth. Within 4 months of that breakthrough, humanity had constructed a fleet. It was not a beautiful fleet. It was rough and angular and practical, built in orbital shipyards that had been assembled with frantic speed from salvaged Conclave materials and human steel and concrete. The ships looked nothing like the elegant curved vessels of the Conclave. They were blunt and aggressive and covered in weapons, and they had names painted on their hulls in bold white letters that the Conclave's translators rendered with varying degrees of confusion. The Teeth of Silence had been renamed. It now bore the designation USS Come and Take It, and it flew at the center of the growing fleet like a stolen crown worn by a new king. The Conclave debated what to do in sessions that grew more desperate with each passing week. The hawks among the elder species demanded overwhelming response. Relativistic kill vehicles launched from outside the system. Planet-cracking weapons deployed from safe distance. A sterilization campaign that would reduce Earth to a lifeless rock before the humans could spread any further. But the doves pointed to the mathematics again, and the mathematics were not encouraging. Every projection showed that even a full-scale sterilization attempt would take time to prepare, and in that time the humans would continue to advance. They already had faster-than-light capability. They were already sending ships to neighboring star systems. If even a small number of humans escaped the destruction of Earth, they would scatter across the galaxy like seeds on the wind, and every colony they established would grow and build and remember what the Conclave had done. And then they would come back. That was the thing the Conclave could not get past. This species held grudges on a civilizational scale. Their own history was full of examples of conquered peoples who waited generations, sometimes centuries, before rising up and overwhelming the empires that had subjugated them. The Romans had fallen, the Mongol Empire had fragmented, the colonial powers had been driven back. Humanity did not forget, and humanity did not forgive, and humanity did not stop, Ambassador Salith stood before the full assembly of the conclave in the obsidian halls of Station Paramount, and delivered the most difficult address in 40,000 years of galactic governance. Voice was steady, but his antenna lay flat against his skull, in a display of submission that no Rithon diplomat had ever shown in living memory. "We awoke something that should have been left to sleep," he said, and the chamber was so quiet that the hum of the station's environmental systems sounded like thunder. Every model we had, every protocol, every assumption about how species respond to superior force, all of it was built on the experiences of civilizations that understood their place in the order of things. Species that looked upon the conclave and saw something greater than themselves, and accepted that greatness as natural and inevitable. He paused, and his compound eyes swept across the assembled representatives of 12 ancient civilizations. Humanity does not see us that way. They looked upon our fleets and our technology and our millennia of dominance, and they did not see gods to be worshipped or masters to be obeyed. They saw a problem to be solved. They saw an obstacle between themselves and the stars, and they went through it the same way they have gone through every obstacle in their history, with their hands and their minds, and their stubborn, relentless, infuriating refusal to accept that anything is impossible. He lowered his head. "We did not conquer them. We educated them. We hand-delivered our technology, our tactics, and our finest warriors to a species that was already the most adaptable and aggressive form of intelligent life this galaxy has ever produced. And now they are coming here, not as supplicants, not as subjects, not as the broken remnants of a pacified world. They are coming as equals, and if we are wise, if we wish our civilizations to survive the next 1,000 years, we will welcome them as such." The vote that followed was the closest in conclave history, but in the end, pragmatism won over pride. A formal invitation was extended to humanity to send a representative to Station Paramount to discuss terms of peaceful coexistence. The response came back within hours. The humans had apparently been waiting for exactly this. 6 months and 14 days after the first Kelvari boot had touched the soil of Earth, a human shuttle docked at Station Paramount. It was escorted by 2 human warships that took up flanking positions outside the station, with the casual confidence of predators who knew they had nothing to fear. The airlock opened, and the first human ambassador stepped into the obsidian halls. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and she was short, barely 5.5 feet tall, which meant she was dwarfed by virtually every species in the chamber. She had dark hair pulled back from her face, and brown eyes that moved across the assembled dignitaries with a sharp intelligence that several species later described as unsettling. She wore a simple dark uniform, with no medals and no decorations, just a small blue and green pin patch on her shoulder that depicted the planet Earth. She walked to the center of the speaking platform, the same platform where Salith had first proposed the subjugation of her species less than a year ago. And she looked up at the towering representatives of 12 civilizations that had ruled the galaxy for longer than her species had existed. And she smiled. It was not a smile of triumph or mockery or contempt. It was warm and genuine, and it reached her brown eyes and made them shine with something that the assembled aliens found difficult to identify at first. It was hope. "So," she said, and her voice carried clearly through the vast chamber, without any need for amplification. "Shall we be friends?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds, before a sound that had never been heard in the obsidian halls of Station Paramount echoed off the ancient walls. It was laughter, human laughter, and it came from Elena Vasquez herself, as she watched the stunned expressions on 100 alien faces. Behind her, through the station's massive viewport, the stars glittered with the engine trails of 100 human ships, exploration vessels charting new systems, science ships studying phenomena that human eyes had never witnessed, trading frigates already establishing commerce routes with independent species who had watched the conclave's humiliation with great interest. Humanity was not waiting for permission. They were already out there, already reaching, already pushing further and faster and harder than any species the galaxy had ever known. Because that was what they did. That was what they had always done. From the first moment some ancient ancestor had looked up at the night sky and wondered what those tiny lights were, humanity had been reaching for something beyond itself. The conclave had sent their finest warriors, and none had returned home to tell the story. But the humans had a story to tell, a story written in fire and determination, and the unbreakable belief that the universe belonged to those brave enough to reach for it. And standing in the heart of a galactic civilization that had ruled for 40,000 years, one small human woman, with hope in her eyes and a smile on her face, was writing the first chapter of something entirely new. The galaxy would never be the same. And somewhere deep in the halls of Station Paramount, old Risk the Kelvari veteran watched the human ambassador through the crowd, and he remembered the water she had given him in the ruins, and the quiet voice that had said, "We will not kneel." And for the first time in his long warrior's life, the scarred old reptile felt something he had no word for in his own language. He would later learn the human word for it. It was respect.